Hello everyone, Jeff with the Green Review. Let's talk about late spring landscape maintenance. First thing is, you can still do all of the things that were on the early spring landscape maintenance schedule that we talked about in a different video. Now let's talk about the zone we're in. This is a 4 to 5 zone area, Hardiness Zone area. And so the things we talk about here for this time of year, you can apply later in the spring if you're farther north, and you need to do them earlier if you're farther south. So let's get started. On lawn areas first, the seeding can be done from mid-April to mid-May in this region of the zones 4 to 5. It's the second best time of year. The first best time of year is in the fall, because that's when you go with the cool season grasses. In zones 4 and 5, we're using bluegrass, ryegrass, fescues, and those are cool season grasses. And if you seed in the fall, you're going through 3 cool seasons in a row, fall, winter, and spring, before you get to the hot, dry summer. So this time of year, mid-April to mid-May, is a good time to do the grass seed, but you're going to go into the warmer season right afterwards, and so you're going to have to do a little bit more care to keep that grass seed growing and before you get into those 3 cool seasons again. Now, if you do have sod or sprigs or plugs, you can do those anytime that you can keep them watered. So those aren't as important for a timing situation. We begin the mowing when the grass is about 1/3 taller than we want it to be. So we're going to mow off 1/3 at a time. If we mow off more than that because the grass is higher, that will set the grass back. And if we mow lower than that, then we're helping the other weed problems and things get in, because we're cutting the grass so low, sunlight gets to the ground. And a lot of grasses don't like to be mowed that low because you're cutting off so much of the grass blade that it can't do very well. We want to have the grass growing as much of a top as possible so that we can have a bigger root system, because these plants are in balance biologically between the top and the bottom. So the more leaves you have, the better the root system. The better the root system, and bigger the root system, then it'll get more water from a larger area of soil, so it can survive the drought better. So we're in this constant fight with the balance there, trying to keep the grass as high as we can to get as big a root system as we can. Now that we're going to do cool season grass fertilizing in mid-May, 1 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. If you're going to leave your clippings in your lawn, you can cut that back to 1/2 pound. We can cut it in half, because the grass clippings decay and become part of that fertilizer. Now the cool season grasses would get fertilized in mid-May and not earlier, and because that's when they start growing. If you fertilize too early in March or April in this region, then the grass may grow, but it also is much more susceptible to diseases at that point. So we're going to wait until mid-May, which is about the time that you see dandelions finishing up. Dandelions will start blooming late April, early May, and so if you're treating for those, whether you see them in somebody else's lawn, then we're going to start that fertilizer after that. It's also the same time that red buds are blooming, crab apples are blooming, so that's a good indicator plants for the time to do the fertilizing. We're going to spot treat weeds when we see them, like those dandelions we were just talking about, so that if we find a weed here, weed there, we don't need to treat the entire lawn. We don't need to do a weed and feed. Weed and feeds can soak into the soil underneath the grass and damage the roots of trees and shrubs. So we just want to do a spot treatment of the weeds as we see them in the yard, not an entire treatment of the entire lawn. We're going to apply crabgrass pre-emergent when we see those red buds and crab apples blooming. A lot of times you'll hear that you should apply crabgrass pre-emergent when forsythias are blooming, which is a few weeks earlier, and that's a good time to maybe go and buy it, but it's better to wait and to put it on until you see those red buds and crab apples blooming. The crabgrass seeds don't sprout until the soil temperature is in the mid-50s. And that's the beginning of the season of when they sprout. And the mid-50s for 5 days in a row. So it has to be warm soil. And so if you start applying it too early, it decays away, and you only get 60 days out of most crabgrass preventers. And so if you apply it too early, then you're not going to have it at the end of the season in the spring when the crabgrass is still sprouting. Crabgrass seeds start when the soil's in the 50s. They do more sprouting when it's, and a lot more when it's in the 70s, and they will continue sprouting new seeds growing into the 90s in the soil temperature. So not just the air temperatures, we're not talking about air temperatures, we're talking about soil temperatures. So you have to have warm air to get to that 50-degree soil temperature. And so don't fertilize too early. There are two products, Barricade and Dimension. Usually I don't like mentioning specific products because they change so often, but those two products are crabgrass preventers that can be applied early and they last the whole season. Most crabgrass preventers don't last more than 60 days or so, and so if you apply them too early, you're going to have to reapply them to really get good control of crabgrass. And crabgrass is annual, and so if you see weed grasses in your lawn early in the spring that were there early in the spring, those are perennial grasses. They're not annuals, so your pre-emergent grass seed preventers will not work on those. You're going to have to find a different product specific to what that weed is. And if it's a perennial grass, then it's going to be a total plant killer that kills the good grass at the same time. And so you're going to, again, want to do spot treatments of just those weeds. For, like, say, orchard grass that's coming up, that's a light green, grows faster than bluegrass. And so you'll see those bunch grasses spotted around in a lawn area. And so you're going to want to do a treatment of just killing that plant off and then letting the good grass grow across or reseeding right in that same spot. This is also the second best time of year to do core aerations. Fall is a better time to do it, but while the grass is growing actively in the spring, you can do it. And again, we want to do the cores 3 inches by 3 inches apart in both directions. That's a lot closer than most rental machines and most machines that the $25 for your lawn core aeration people will have. So they're going to have to go over the lawn several times to get side by side to get all those cores 3 inches by 3 inches. And it's really best if they're going down 6 to 8 inches, or 10 or 12 inches is even better. And most of those machines don't do that either. So for the most part, the rental machines don't do a very good job of core aerations unless you really have a soft soil where you've watered it and you can get that core really deep into the soil. Now let's move on to trees and shrubs. When it comes to trees and shrubs in the spring, one of the things we wanted to look at is how to do the pruning. The oaks and elms especially, we want to stop pruning as they start leafing out in the spring, because any of the wounds will have sap that will attract bark beetles and other insects, and those insects spread diseases to the oaks and elms. So we want to stop pruning the oaks and elms first thing in the spring before they start leafing out. We do prune pines in what was called the candle stage, and that's where the candelabra kind of looking new growth comes up, and it's very easy to prune, and a lot of times the candles just snap off. You can just bend them over and they just break away. And by pruning at that point, the buds that are at the base of the needle clusters will start to grow, and you'll end up with a denser pine tree. They'll have more branches. If you don't prune during this stage, then those buds don't grow, and you'll end up with just a bare space if you try to prune back the pines. So pines are very time dependent, and we want to do it when the candle growth is there, and we want to do it so that we can just snap those candles right off. And if a shrub or a tree blooms before mid-June, we have about 2 months after that time to do the pruning. Otherwise, after that, we'll start cutting off the next year's flower buds. So we want to do our pruning on the spring bloomers during this first couple months after they bloom. And you can do the pruning while they're in bloom to bring those branches in for a vase indoors. And a lot of times you can even prune them a few weeks early and bring them in, so you'll have more flowers for a longer period of time if you do that. Another thing we want to do for the trees and shrubs in the spring is protect them from rabbits and other rodents, especially if you're doing any planting of new stuff. The plants may get gnawed on by those guys, and so we want to put up a little fencing if we need to, or we can spray them with deer and rabbit repellents. And then fertilizing should be done if the soil test says to do it. If there isn't a soil test, then how do you know how much to apply? And so you can follow the label directions, of course, but in general, most trees and shrubs have very wide root systems that are not just in the local flower beds, and so it becomes very difficult to try to fertilize them. And it needs to be done on a diagnosis basis, whether when we see that the leaves are chlorotic or for some reason we need to do the fertilizing, then we'll do the fertilizing to treat that specific plant. So now let's check out the annuals, perennials, and vegetables. In the flower beds, it's a great idea to apply mulch as soon as you can in the spring. And if you didn't get this done during the early spring, you can still do it in the late spring here. You might have to lift up some of the leaves of the plants, and then you can put mulch around them. And so do that as soon as you can to all of your flower beds and your fruit tree areas and around the trees. All the mulch areas can be done any time of the year, but early spring is a really great time of year to do it. The second best time of year to divide perennials is in the spring. A lot of perennials do best in the fall, and the ones that you really must do in the fall are daylilies, iris, and peonies, but the other ones you can still be doing in the spring if you need to. Start your vegetable seeds in the house 4 to 8 weeks before you're going to be planting them outdoors, and they'll be good little plants so you can move them outdoors. So plan ahead as to when your planting date is, depending on when your frost and freeze dates are, and so you can start those vegetables early. Rototill your vegetable gardens when the soil is not wet. If you rototill it when it's wet, it'll become really messy and clumped all over the tines on the rototiller and not do very well. And then also a lot of times you'll end up damaging the soil structure. So you would want to do that when the soil is not wet. And actually the best time of year to do the rototilling is in the fall, and you can leave it in large clumps and not have to do the fine grade raking. And then in the spring, all you'll need to do is some raking. So the best time of year to do the rototilling is actually in the fall. Plant your cool season crops now. If you've got any, you know when your last frost date is. Right now this is in the middle of May, and this is the time of year for our last killing freeze, and that's why I'm wearing a jacket. It's actually very cold out right now, and so even though this is the late spring, we are having a cold spell, and that is normal. Whenever your last frost date average is, you get that average by having some frost dates much later and some that are much earlier, and the middle is where the average is. So it could be a frost next week and still be normal because it's part of that curve that makes the average here in the middle. So watch for your last frost date on your fruits and vegetables. Don't plant your annuals out too early. Don't put the petunias and begonias and geraniums out too early, because you'll get a frost and you'll have to move everything in, and if you planted them in the ground you'll have to cover them. And there's an old nurseryman saying, plant early and plant often, and you don't want to be part of that. So pay attention to your weather forecasts and your average last frost date, and so you'll know when to do your planting. And now let's move to the water garden. It's important for fish health and for clear water to keep the leaves out of your pond. So make sure you clean your skimmer, and if there's not a skimmer, make sure you're constantly getting the leaves out of the pond. And then you may need to do water changes as necessary to keep the water from being a tea color due to the breakdown of the leaves. That is kind of like a tea bag effect, with the water. And so you want to make sure that you're keeping it clean by keeping the debris out. You can turn your pumps and waterfalls on when the temperatures are above 40 degrees. That's the temperature that the puddle of the water that's settled to the bottom in the fall is. And so if you mix the water with the cold water over the top, then you're going to have the problem with the fish not being in that 40-degree puddle. So once the water warms up to 40 degrees on the surface, then the whole pond is doing a changeover, and you can have the waterfalls and the pumps running. You add new fish and plants based on water temperatures. So if you're going to add cool water fish like the koi and goldfish, you can add them at lower temperatures. But if they're coming from a pet store where there's warm water, you may need to do some acclimating to make sure that they can fit in with the proper water temperature. If you're buying tropical water lilies, then you're going to need the water in the 70s before you start planting those. So you want to have the new stuff being added based on the water temperature. We start feeding the fish, when the koi and goldfish, when the water temperatures are over 55 degrees, and then you can keep them up with the proper immune system and all those things. If you start feeding too early, then they might have digestive problems. So you want to, everything in our pond is based on water temperature. So you want to make sure that you have a thermometer, you can put it in your skimmer, and so you'll know where it's at. And so just keep track of all the changes that are going on based on the water temperature. And this has been a Greener View. Thanks for watching.